So, welcome. I want to introduce myself. My name is Kristen Ruiz. I'm here with Geneva, Mayne, and our special guest, Dr. Kittie Verdolini Abbott. So, in our podcast here, we ask what it is to have agency over one's voice. So, today's exploration is on this spiritual act of forgiveness as an agentic practice for voice users, singers, including those recovering from trauma, and for those practitioners whose job it is to empower other voices. So research suggests the practice of forgiveness is correlated to improved health, well-being, and mental health. So today we want to explore what that might mean for vocal freedom.
Okay, before we get into that, let's start with our first segment. What's new, what's good? What's new and what's good with you ladies today?
Well, I could jump in real quick. And speaking of personal agency, I'm watching my daughter step into her next level of freedom. So she just got her learner's permit. And while it pulls on my heartstrings, not going to lie, it's just such a great reminder for how important it is for all of us to keep growing, keep expanding our comfort zone, stepping into that next fullest version of ourselves. So while I'm mourning my baby girl as she's kind of stepping up into her next level of self, I'm also celebrating and kind of cherishing the idea of growth and what that means for me and for all of us.
So cool. What about you, Kittie?
Well, we are in the process of purchasing a new home, and until about an hour and a half ago, we were in a very bad situation because we haven't sold our current home yet. And we're supposed to be closing in 3 weeks. So this has been very stressful. But our mortgage broker came up with a very creative solution that is going to allow us to close whether we sell right now or not. So that is a big load off of our minds and hearts.
Good luck for the next couple of weeks for you.
Thank you.
Whew. And for me, I'm super excited. I'm on cloud nine. I had a completely different what's new and what's good to share. And I forgot what it is because I got an email today saying that my first acceptance to AJSLP with some minor edits, and I'm so excited about that. Oh my God.
Was that the paper that Yeah, there's a bunch of lines there of little things, but they're all trivial, though, really trivial. Yeah.
I'm just like, wow, like, when I see it in print or even online, I'll be in like a different place entirely, but it just feels so good because, I know it's not the same as having a baby.
Oh, believe me.
It's an
there are
academic
parallels. There are definitely parallels.
Yeah, so
Congratulations for a job very nicely done.
Good for you, Geneva. That's awesome.
Yes. So we can move on now to our experience, strength, and hope.
Yeah. This is going to be awesome. So I have to say, with our guest today, when I think of the name Dr. Kittie Verdolini Abbott, I think of vocology, motor learning, resonant voice therapies. I think of SVI. That's where I first got to learn under you. And I think of voice expert and, not going to lie, some really awesome athleisure wear. I remember really liking those outfits. But so today I'm excited and curious to hear your thoughts on forgiveness and how that might connect to agency of voice.
I thought about Kittie because I remember when we were at the Summer Vocology Institute at the University of Utah, you, Kittie, were completing, I believe, a Master's of Divinity degree. Is that correct?
I was in the process of ordination at the time, which so ordination, at least in my denomination, requires a Master of Divinity and then a whole bunch of other things. And I was in the process of completing that whole bunch of other things. And I was ordained in April of 2019.
Okay. So why, after like having a whole career and degree and specialization in voice and doing research, did you decide to do that process? So why was, spirituality and going through that process important to you?
Well, there are a lot of parallels with my story with voice. I didn't so much select or pick or choose it. It chose me. And when something chooses you, you can say no a certain number of times, but you're not going to get away. It's going to keep knocking on your door. And so there were experiences that I had that I kept ignoring until I couldn't ignore them anymore, and responded to what sometimes people call a call, and not to trivialize the term. And I remember, especially some of my minister friends were asking me at the time, why are you doing this? Because I was well into my 50s. I had an established career in voice science and speech pathology. And my response was always, if you're asking me what I'm doing it for, so for what application, I don't know.
Mhm.
But if you're asking me why I'm doing it because I have to.
Mm.
I simply have to. And it was the same sort of a business with my whole voice career. Why I went into voice, my first memory of my life was singing on the kitchen floor and banging lids of pots, and making vibrato with my voice and announcing to my mother that I was going to be a singer when I grew up. Then I did a whole bunch of singing growing up, and then I had a whole bunch of injuries, and so each step for me has unfolded itself. People often come to me, especially, doc students and what have you, or even if they're thinking about doing a PhD, and they say, that they would like to make a 5 or a 10-year plan, and how does one do that? And I always say, well, if you're the kind of person who needs to do a plan, please be my guest. I do not have any clue how one does that because I never did it. For me, the next step just always presented itself and I responded. So my only merit in any of that was my responding to these next steps that presented themselves to me. I don't recommend that for everybody. A lot of people need a plan. I never had a plan. Never had a plan. Still don't.
Love the stickiness of those calls. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, they stick. They do stick.
I think a lot of people can relate to that. I think a lot of people end up in caring professions like speech pathology in a similar way, as you said. I kind of landed in speech pathology, not knowing what it was, but kind of being directed there. And I remember my first job out of grad school, I said the same thing when I spoke to the interviewer. He said, "Are you sure this is what you want to do?" And I said, "I feel called to do it." So I feel that really resonates with me that you use that word. So we can get deeper into our agentic practice for today, which was forgiveness. So what does the research say about forgiveness?
Yeah, so there's actually a significant body of work looking at the adverse effects of unforgiveness on both physical health and mental health. So the adverse effects of unforgiveness on physical and mental health, and that a forgiving personality can lead to a decrease in negative experiences, risky health behaviors, unhealthy coping mechanisms, and an increase. So a forgiving personality seems to have an increase in relational well-being and spiritual well-being. So that some of that came out of a 2015 study, but there's a lot when you start digging up. So in the literature, like, what is the definition of forgiveness? So I know.
That's the first sticking point. What is the definition of forgiveness?
Well, it's kind of a prismatic thing, right? So one of the lenses in a 2020 paper was saying that one definition is a shift in motivation away from retaliation and avoidance towards increased goodwill for the perceived wrongdoer. And what they were saying is that this plays a vital role in restoring social relationships and positively impacting personal well-being and even society at large. And they were using some neuroscientific evidence. They used neuroimaging studies, and they built kind of a theoretical framework, which kind of accounts for what they were trying to do is look at what are some of the mechanisms at play underlying forgiveness. So they kind of did this, they integrated some empirical evidence from social psychology and neuroscience, and they proposed the idea that forgiveness relies on three distinct interacting psychological, they call them macro components. So there's a level of cognitive control, there's a level of perspective taking, and social valuation, like how much is this actually worth? So that was how they broke it down in that paper. And then there's other things that kind of suggest there's decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness, that they're not the same. That one might be behavioral intention, and the other is more of a replacement of negative emotions. And then there was some stuff in a 2019 study that talked about self-forgiveness, that there are some indications that what they called self-compassion and self-forgiveness may alter the relationship between negative life events and even self-harm. So, so there's a lot to this as we try and unpack it in our in our time together. Yeah, Geneva, I know you have some things that you were looking into.
Well, just in the research that I've been doing in my doctoral program, one of the things that came up for trauma survivors was that positive religious coping, such as forgiveness and reliance on a higher power, are associated with resilience, whereas negative religious coping, where people end up blaming God or a higher power, or have anger towards God or a higher power, are not. But I would argue, they were looking at the context of forgiveness in terms of religion, but I would argue that everyone benefits from forgiveness, whether they practice a religion or not.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So do you have any more thoughts about anything that we just talked about, or what do you think, Kittie?
Yeah, everyone benefits, and yeah, I forget who it was. It might have been the Dalai Lama. I think somebody in the Buddhist tradition who said that, maintaining anger and vitriol towards another person is like taking poison and expecting another person to be harmed by it. So, I think, very serious arguments are made that the first person to benefit from forgiveness is the forgiver, right? Which isn't normally the way that we think about forgiveness. We tend to think about forgiveness as a grace that will benefit another person, or another who has been an offender. And here, I think we also touch on the business that there are some circumstances in which there's a clear offender, perpetrator, and there's a clear victim. Okay, there are some cases in which that is absolutely the case, at an individual level and also at a societal and structural level. But probably for most of us, in most of our lives, that distinction is not so clear cut. So I think that part of the forgiveness process, in many cases, certainly not all cases, involves the hard job of looking at our own complicity, sort of looking at the speck in our, or the log in our own eye before we look at the speck in somebody else's eye. And I think that forgiveness is facilitated. One of my pastors once talked about forgiveness in the best case scenario, which is not necessarily that common, but in the best case scenario of forming a new harmony, a new relationship, a new cell in what he called God's kingdom. I don't think we need to invoke the term God for that to make sense. So it involves the establishment of a new cell of human functioning, a new partnership in human functioning. And so I think sometimes when we feel that we're having difficulty forgiving somebody, and the definition that you had, Kristen, I think is the most challenging case. And I think in some of our exchanges we've talked about, if somebody cuts you off, in traffic, you kind of flip them the bird, and then, you're not going to think about it anymore. So, is that really forgiveness? Well, you're not going to think about it anymore, and you probably don't harbor any ill will towards some anonymous person. But the harder cases are the cases where someone has done you grievously wrong, whether it's an individual or a society or a group, and you were not complicit. But let's assume the case that I think is probably the case for most of what we encounter in our lives. In some ways, we may have been complicit. Even socially. And I think that if we're having difficulty feeling that emotional release, So not just saying, oh, I forgive you. My mother-in-law used to say, oh, I can forgive people, but I'm never going to talk to them again. Well, what do you mean by forgiveness then? She was a firecracker. So I think that part of forgiveness may start in many cases, ideally, in the creation of this new cell of partnership, involves looking at our own selves, which can be very painful, especially if on the surface, the wrong that was done to us looks very big on the part of the person we're considering the perpetrator. But are we complicit? And were we complicit? Are we continuing to be complicit? And sometimes maybe if we start from that place, we can invite a dialogue that will help to soften another person's self-examination, soften the other person's heart, where it's possible to establish a new partnership. That's not always, on the surface, it seems like it's not easy. When I have done this a few times in my life, actually, once you do it, you go, well, that was easier than I thought, because sometimes the whole situation melts right in front of your eyes, a situation that was very contentious. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, we have the situation where even if we were complicit and the identified perpetrator persists in the offense, or the offense has been very grievous and there's no sense of self-examination or apology on the part of this other person, I think forgiveness does not exclude calling somebody or something out. It does not. Mm-hmm. It does not exclude that.
You said so many things that I'm trying to process and chew over. I really like how you are emphasizing the relational aspects of forgiveness. Because to me, if you're making a distinction between religion and spirituality, spirituality is really the focus on how you relate either to God or the universe or your surroundings and to other people. Mm-hmm. So when someone is making the choice to forgive or dealing with issues of forgiveness, it's deeply relational, no matter what you're trying to relate to.
Deeply.
And when you think about the fact that social support, which is relational, is a determinant of health, you can see why forgiveness is something that can impact your health. It's relational. Yeah. And I agree that when you're doing that deep, intensive work, I think about, the times in my life when I've had to really search, do an inventory, basically, to figure out why did this wrong happen? Where did it happen? What was my part in it? And that kind of thing. It was really hard work because, first of all, it's hard to look in the mirror. We need filters now, right, on social media, because we don't like to look in mirrors, right? So there's that piece of it. We don't like to look and see, the cuts and the bruises and the bumps. And it's work that you can't really do unless you're looking through a filter of compassion for yourself and for the other person.
True.
And so I think those are the things that are jumping right out when you say it. I don't know about complicity, especially for things that are structural.
Yeah.
I think it's tough because there are people who are very, very hard on themselves. And people can make the mistakes of victim blaming or victim shaming. I think it's hard to talk about complicity.
Right, exactly. There are cases in which we should not be looking at complicity. There are cases in which there is a unidirectional offense, and that needs to be called out. However, I do want to pick up on the structural issues. Where there are structural issues of inequity, and in my denomination, the history of my denomination has been very focused on social justice. That is its foundation, or an important foundation. Where there are structural inequities, I think there are two issues there. One is the person or the people who are participating in those structural inequities without really realizing what those inequities are or without knowingly participating in an offense. Okay. That is one issue in the forgiveness landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And another issue is the inequity, the structural inequity itself. I think we can call out individuals. I think we can always start with softness and compassion in our heart for a person who just might not realize it and might not see it.
Right.
And I think a good starting point there for the individual, or for typically small groups of individuals, is with a compassionate heart to recognize their humanity.
Right.
And I can recognize my own humanity. There are errors that I have made that I didn't realize. There are triggers that I have triggered in people that I did not realize. And it's helpful for those people to not call me out in the sense of putting me down, but say, ouch.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But when
That
they
makes
don't,
sense.
I think we need a bigger voice.
Mm-hmm.
We can forgive the human for being human.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need a bigger voice. It's not okay. Forgiving somebody, I don't think means saying that what they did was okay.
There's still a role for accountability. And what I'm kind of hearing is the idea of, advocacy and having a heart of wanting justice, but holding on to mercy and compassion, and holding both energies at the same time. And what does that mean when we look at something through the lens of those things in combo?
And when you look through a trauma, when you look through a trauma lens, and someone has put you through a situation of adversity or hardship, it is a challenge to not react in a emotional way, to be emotionally reactive or even explosive, right? But I think you're right in terms of pointing out. I wouldn't say the issue is complicity in this particular sense in terms of structural things,
Right.
but we do have a responsibility of communicating, hey, you've wronged me, but saying it in a way that the receiver can receive it.
Right. Yes.
And not put them not putting them in a defensive posture, right?
Right.
I agree with that. I think that makes sense to me because, again, the issue is relational. The reason why we're so offended and we're so hurt is because it's a huge breach of trust. I cannot trust you anymore.
And there's also the issue that the inequity or the harm was not only visited upon us individually, but if that harm continues to be perpetrated, we need to speak on behalf of others who are being or who will be harmed.
Right. Right.
And so this brings up another issue. One of the reasons I think that it's hard for us to forgive, and I think in most cases it is, apart from somebody cutting us off in traffic. Okay, so the big issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that there is a human impulse towards vengeance, right? And one of the things that's been important for me in my own life in this trajectory has been to remember the passage, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, or in another tradition, there's karma. Okay, I trust karma, right?
Me too.
And just sitting back and so I don't have the tools, I don't have the strength, I don't have the power to visit vengeance on another person. And if it is to be visited, I have to give. So forgiveness in that sense, or being willing to let go of the impulse towards vengeance, is a letting go. And we're back to the understanding of forgiveness as some form of letting go.
Yes. When I think about vengeance, I think about Captain Ahab and the whale, right? If you're pursuing something and it's consuming your life, something that happened in the past, it's neither in the present and it's not your future unless you keep revisiting the past, thinking about vengeance. So, although we think vengeance is something that is going to hurt other people, it's literally eating up our life, our goals, our dreams. That other person might be living their life and moving on, and you're stuck.
Right.
So yes, it is totally human to be consumed by vengeance. But to look at it as something that you can be free from, that you can give up so that you can pursue what's, your own trajectory, what you really want to do. I've been reading Charlemagne the God's books. And he talks about the energy that you put out into the universe, like the energy that you put out into the world, it will, like you said, karma, keep on revisiting you.
Yeah.
So if what you're receiving from the world is not something that you yourself are not enjoying, you want to try a shift in energy, right? Because if the energy that you're putting out is one of anger and resentment and vengeance, that's what you're going to receive back.
Oh, you bet.
Right. But if what you're putting out is peace and love and goal directedness and inspiration and creativity and growth, that's what comes back to you. So that's one of the things that I think about, but it's hard when you're in it.
Yeah, and I think about, if we're talking about voice, I think about a couple of patients that I had, maybe three, and two of these patients were speech pathology master students, and they ended up on my caseload. And both of them, I do a fair amount of manual work in my therapy. And when I approach these young women, in both cases, I felt something happening. And I stopped and I said, do you feel comfortable talking about what's going on? And in both cases, they related to me a history of sexual abuse by their fathers in childhood, right? And so in cases of sexual abuse and rape, often the, I don't like the word victim, but I'll use it here, the victim checks out mentally during the assault, right? And so they can come over time to associate physical sensations with a need to check out, with fear, with panic, right? And so with one of these patients, we just said, no, we're just going to do vocal function exercises. We're not going to do this introspective stuff. How many seconds can you sustain this sound, right? With the other one, she said, I was going down that route. She says, no, wait. And she picked up the phone right then. This was when cell phones didn't exist, a long time ago. She called her therapist, and we all got on the phone right then and there. And the therapist said, you know what? No. She feels safe with you. And I think her voice work involving introspection to physical sensations can actually be helpful in her psychotherapy. Because what would happen was when she would have a flashback, when she would have an attack, she would go into a corner, get down in a fetal position and rock and completely check out. And the therapist told me, what I'm trying to do with her in therapy is that when she has these moments, to stay in her body, to feel her feet on the ground. And I think that this voice work can actually help not only her voice, but help in the psychotherapeutic process. So we collaborated together. And she had wonderful success with her therapy, went back to performing, wrote me a beautiful letter years later. And so I think that speaks directly to what you're talking about with voice therapy and agentic possibilities. And I do want to respond to that word agentic here in this context of forgiveness. There are two major domains, camps in learning theory in the contemporary era, but you can trace them back to a few thousand years ago. One is the Skinner thing, according to which the environment shapes us, right? That we come into this world blank slate, tabula rasa, and it's the environment that writes on our brains and shapes us, right? With rewards and punishments. And then there is the cognitive science domain, in which I am schooled, that says that we have agency. And we come into the world with this agency. Now, I am a cognitive scientist. I am not in love with a lot of Skinner. And stepping over, 4 steps here, we can also relate these to different camps in theology, and by extension, spirituality. Theology is cool because it doesn't necessarily link itself to a religion, and I understand religion to involve doctrine often, and specific practices. So we're talking about spirituality here. In theology, there are 2 different camps that are about works. In the New Testament, we can find reference to that in James, versus grace. And here we find references to the grace theology in Paul, okay, in Romans. And this was the big lightning bolt, the big aha for Luther, because he was trying to pay for his sins, and the Catholic Church was trying to get people to pay for their sins with indulgences, with paying, literal money paying for sins, right? And Luther similarly had this big aha where he decided that the payment of sins comes from grace. Okay, it can't come from within. So there are a lot of discussions and debates about, grace versus works and all this. I'm not going to get into that. But we have a parallel in a lot of different domains of scholarship about the importance of agency, of what we can do for ourselves, and what element is done for us. So one of the things that I would like to say about my own forgiveness practices is that, yes, we do have agency. And there's also some stuff that's bigger than me. It's just bigger than me. And I also did for several years, and I'm trying to get back to it, transcendental meditation, which I think is incredibly powerful. It's actually, in difference to what might be popular opinion, it's not linked to a religion. It's not necessarily linked to certain worldviews. It is about calming down the nervous system. And so I think that when we're talking about forgiveness, a lot of what we're talking about here in the vengeance and in the holding on to the poison has to do with physiological arousal, right?
Absolutely.
And there are sometimes practices in which we can engage. If we can't convince ourselves to forgive somebody, or if we can convince ourselves intellectually, but that conviction doesn't reach our hearts and we still hold on to the poison, I think that there are practices in which we can engage that will help us to release the physiological foundation of unforgiveness. And that might be in the TM tradition, or in other meditation traditions, or in contemplative prayer, or what have you. And by the way, I'm in love with what I know about Sufism. It's interesting to me. In all of the monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, there are mystical branches, and I most closely associate myself with those more than the doctrinal stuff, which I think separates us.
When I think about forgiveness and the voice user, and I do come from a singer-centric perspective, I work with a lot of singers who have issues with performance anxiety. I have my own relationship with them losing function because of that experience. And I think that for those listening who may be struggling with that, where they feel like in one room they have access to their voice and their confidence at one level, and then in another room it's completely obliterated because of that performance anxiety, I have to wonder if forgiveness might be part of this story, and forgiveness towards the outside, or even, as we talked about before, that self-compassion, self-forgiveness, about holding on. When I think about holding on to anger and vengeance, sometimes that can be rerouted towards self. Right. And so one of the questions that I'm curious what your thoughts are, would there necessarily be a connection in your the way you think about it? Is there a connection with the lack of self-forgiveness and performance anxiety? Because I can think of singers that I'm working with who they're holding on to the times that they weren't able to show up in their fullness, and they're holding on to that resentment so strong that it literally comes on stage with them as if it's another entity. And so where does that role of forgiveness come for the person struggling in that realm?
I think that's really, really great. I was trained classically, and at in the music school in the conservatory, we had, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, we had juries. Why do they call them juries? Which implies a verdict of innocent or guilty.
So much for mindset.
Yeah, so much for mindset. And I know that for me, there was huge trauma. We can talk about trauma as singers. There was huge trauma in auditions and in juries about incredibly unkind things that were said. I remember in one jury, I was in the studio of a very famous Wagnerian soprano who had performed at the Met for 40 years. And I remember her saying, Kittie? Well, she was really annoyed because I had switched from the Fach of lyric coloratura to contralto without asking her. And she was a control freak, right?
So and got a power system.
Oh, she was furious. And so I came in and I sang a contralto countertenor piece, right? She was furious. And she said, Kittie, the first memory of my life was that I sang. And I said, Miss Harsha, mine too. And she said, then why did I make it and you didn't? Okay. Now, for somebody who is born a singer, I don't even care how well you sing. You're a singer in your mind, in your heart, right? And I get tears in my eyes when I even think of that, right? And talk about trauma, right? And so, yes, that is a really excellent point. The trauma of judgment of others that we then incorporate, that we then integrate.
Yes.
And yes, so the next time you open your mouth as a singer, what is possibly going to be, and I have had the experience several times of working with actors, and I might have been doing a master class and I've asked, an actor to sing. And I have found that actors are much more willing on average to be open and vulnerable than singers. Actors don't have juries. There is just a different tradition. These are parallel traditions. But God help you if you go into a jury or an audition as a singer and you leave yourself open. Yeah.
The vulnerability factor is really high because I've worked with musicians who learn to sing later on. So I should say not musician, instrumentalists who then learn to sing. I actually really believe in that distinction. Yes. I don't like the idea of singers not being considered musicians. Exactly. So instrumentalists who want to learn to sing and actors who want to learn to sing, and all of them have reported that inflated sense of, oh my gosh, I'm vulnerable, I'm open now. And I think it must come down to this idea of voice and identity. That it's so interwoven. And so my curiosity in having this conversation is, could forgiveness of self and forgiveness of those aggressors, could that be possibly, and I mean, and even beyond injuries, absolutely. I think a lot of us can stand up and have like a support group about going through those auditions and injuries, but also the aunt that says, "Ah, you should be singing louder," or the other person who says, "Why don't you sound more like him?" Or "That's not like the CD," all of that stuff. So I'm wondering, could forgiveness of self and forgiveness of those just insensitive comments, could that be part of the path of healing?
Yeah, that's wonderful. That is absolutely wonderful. And a study comes to mind that is related to this topic. Both of you did SVI. I'm pretty sure I covered the study, but pretty fast. It was a study in golf, and they were looking at golfers who choked and performed poorly under stress versus those who did not. Okay, under stress induction. Okay. So stress is a person by situation interaction, right? And what they found was, and so they induced stress with experimental manipulations, including the social evaluative component. Okay. And the hypothesis was that people who perform poorly under stress get anxious. And so we should train them in techniques to not become anxious. But that's not what they found. They found that people who performed poorly and people who performed well under stress induction had the same amount of a stress response, same degree and type of stress response as measured physiologically and with patient report. Okay. The difference was what they were doing mentally. The people, and they did this with self-report, but they also had electroencephalographic results that were consistent with self-report. The people who performed poorly said that they were giving themselves all kinds of instructions, verbal, analytical instructions, like how to swing the club and, how, where to put your feet and, blah, 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 blah. The people who performed well reported that they had target awareness. So they had a perceptual awareness of where that ball needed to go before they even took a swing. And so they were, as one student once put it, she was an Italian, she said, with some of the methods that I use in teaching, non ero nel compito, I was not in the task, meaning she was so at one with the task that she wasn't watching herself do it. Right? And so these golfers who performed well under stress were one with the task, without judgment, without a lot of words, without all this kind of stuff. And so the idea here is not that we should train people to not have a stress response, because actually that stress response is helpful for good performance. There's a certain amount of stress response and that's well documented. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, 1901 or something like that. The issue is what we are doing mentally and whether we are giving ourselves a lot of negative feedback and words. You're so stupid and you're not doing it right. And, you never hit that note straight because remember what your aunt said about it.
Yeah.
As opposed to being called, we're back to call, by and being in love with the task itself.
Wow.
Being in love with the task itself.
So that self-compassion that you have in your self-talk can really help you in terms of getting into that flow state, which you've spoken about, Kristen, and making you so at one with your task that it doesn't matter what's going on around you. You just perform well. That's amazing.
Well, and we can also be one with the audience, right? I remember when I was in high school and performing, I remember being on stage, I could see the conductor, I could see his baton, the lights kind of blinded me. I could see that there were people in the first row, but nothing beyond that. And I'm sure you've both had this feeling of oneness with the audience. So here we get back to the model of forgiveness again, is that this is relational. And I think Lesak, in his genius, he always talked about voice as relational, and it can be relational self to self or relational self with other, not to other, but with other. And that's the way that I view the therapy process too. I don't view the therapy process as directional or hierarchical. I view it as a cycle. So many times patients have healed me without me ever saying a word of what was going on, but they have healed me. So we're in a healing cycle. Their energy comes into me and something in me cleanses it and sends it back out, and they cleanse my energy and they send it back out.
That's that co-regulation. That's amazing. This is really such a rich conversation. And like, I'm saying words like hinting towards closing just because I'm looking at the clock, but it feels like we could go on forever speaking about this topic. So I guess my last question, just so that we're not so abruptly ending, is I've heard a lot of really good things. And, I've heard you say some things are above you. I've heard you really embrace the idea of agency. So I guess the question that I'm asking is forgiveness a choice?
Kristen, what do you think?
I think that it's bigger than a yes or no answer. I think that there's, and I'm okay with apparent contradictions living in harmony together. So the idea of, not confusing that with cognitive dissonance, but the idea of yes, it's a choice. And yes, for a lot of us, it requires a source larger than ourselves. And I think that the goal has to be about freeing ourselves from anger and resentment and what that leads to. And if we think about forgiveness, if we are wired for connection, humanity, I mean, the interconnectedness of all things, right? Human to human, in terms of our humanity, human to creation, human to universe, creation to universe, like it's all interconnected. So the idea of unforgiveness in our heart is the breaking of something that's supposed to be unified. So when I think of something being broken versus something being unified and connected, and if forgiveness is the path to that, then I think, okay, as a voice user, as somebody whose job it is to help empower other voices, then this is an energy and activity of connection that I think if we think about the spirit that is free from anger and resentment, I have to personally connect the dot to that, to cleaner, easier access to voice. And then just quoting quick a friend of mine who says, free people, free people.
Right.
So I think I didn't answer your question.
Well, and I love your answer. And I would say, I think there's a choice aspect to it in many cases. In some cases, see, choice implies conscious cognitive involvement, right? And conscious operations are very slow compared to non-conscious ones, okay? So that is and Kahneman, this cognitive scientist Kahneman, who's written, he spent his whole career talking about these two matters, thinking fast and thinking slow. So yeah, I think there can be, and there often has to be, a slow thinking decision to forgiveness. And there are other cases that forgiveness happens much faster than we could ever make a decision. So for example, my 4-year-old grandson, who is the center of my universe, I will just make up a scenario where he broke a $500 vase that my mother had bought in a French flea market. Okay. That didn't happen, but it could, right? And I can imagine him coming to me immediately with big tears in his eyes and saying, Mimi, I am sorry. I don't have the time to decide to forgive. Forgiveness is there, and it flows freely. And I agree with Kristen. I don't think we have to decide one or the other. And I think different circumstances will dictate different answers and different proportions of those elements.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, I feel so just enriched by this conversation. I feel very fortunate to be able to rub minds with you wonderful ladies. You know, they say
Likewise.
iron sharpens iron, and I feel sharper today.
Yes.
Wonderful. And this conversation has done me personally a world of good. I'm reminded of domains in my life where I need to come back to this.
Mm. Mm.
So thank you.